Mierda.
Eating the anti-racist drug, I suppose, because they're looking for that in your life. That's part of the reason, to the degree that we're just not exploiting the situation. And we talked about sources of deep meaning. And for Matt and for myself, the meanings in our life have really come from our dedication to our wives and our families, our kids and our grandkids, in my case, because I'm older than Matt.
No.
So we talked a lot about sources of true meaning and false meaning. And so you can join us for that.
Cuidado.
Amiracist.com.
No
That's the
tengo más
URL
gomitas.
you want to keep in mind. Join us.
Qué bel
Hello,
machete que
Mr.
tengo,
Walsh.
boludo.
I hear you have a movie coming up. Do you want to tell everybody what it is and when it's breaking and all of that?
Yeah, we do. We have movies coming out September 13th. Am I Racist is the title. And tickets are on pre-sale right now. We opened up pre-sale about a week ago. It's already going, really well on the pre-sale for the tickets, which is important because that, determines in large part how many theaters actually show the movie. So people are responding in a big way, and I'm excited about it.
Am I Racist? September 13th. Well, I suppose we could cut right to the punchline. We'll start with you. Are you racist?
Well, that feels like a spoiler, I guess. I mean, look, one thing we learn in the movie is that I'm white, so I guess the answer is yes. That is how they define racism on the anti-racist side. That if you're white, you're if you're not, then you're not racist, no matter what you say or do. So, from their perspective, the answer is yes. And it's actually, unlike What Is a Woman, the first movie that we made, obviously, that was a question that they didn't want to answer. It was hard for them to answer. This for them is an easy question to answer. Now, if you were to follow up and say, well, what exactly do you mean by racism? What is racism exactly? Then that becomes a more difficult question. But they have no problem pointing to the people who they consider racist, and really, it's just a matter of looking at your skin color and deciding from there.
All right, so maybe we could try this. Maybe I could try to give a case from a psychological perspective for the leftist claims, and we could take them apart that way. And I think it is, it's a hard conversation to delve into because I don't exactly think this is properly characterized as a leftist claim. It's partly that, but it's also partly a claim of devious, manipulative, psychopathic narcissists. And that's not exactly the same as a political or an intellectual claim. Just like on the religious front, the religious claims of great monotheistic systems are often hijacked by bad actors and manipulators. That's the Pharisees in the gospel accounts. You see the same thing on the political side, but let's delve into this a little bit because there's plenty to be said about the idea of, well, we could start with implicit bias. So that's something that the scientific community centered at Harvard around Mazrin Banaji and her work on the implicit association test. That idea of implicit bias is something that the scientific community has offered to the radicals to buttress their claims. So maybe we could delve into that a little bit because people need to understand this. Is that reasonable as far as you're concerned?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Okay, so your perceptions, all of our perceptions are biased, and they're biased towards our goals. So when you look at the world, basically what you see is a pathway forward to a goal that you're pursuing, and then you see the things in the world that will either help you along that pathway or get in your way. Everything else is turned into irrelevance. And obviously, when we look at the world, we don't see most of it, right? We see what's right in front of us, for example, but even more specifically, we see a pathway to a goal and things that move us towards that and things that get in the way. And that could be friends and foes, for example. So your goals do determine your perceptions in a large manner. Now, there's exceptions to that, like if something unexpected happens, because if something unexpected happens and it stops you from moving forward, that will attract your attention and you'll turn to investigate it. But that's basically the perceptual landscape. And one of the implications of that is that we do live inside something that, if it's described seems like a story rather than a set of facts. Okay, so this has been more or less understood for something approximating 100 years because the psychoanalytic types like Freud and then Jung kind of cottoned on to this first, that we have a perceptual structure that filters the world when we interact with it. Now, the social psychologists got a hold of that, and they built a test that purported to measure implicit bias, and they showed that the research is unclear, and at best it's speculative and theoretical. They purported to show that we had perceptual biases that favored our in-groups. And that's not really that surprising as far as I'm concerned, because, you know, you obviously have a inbuilt preference to care for yourself, and then you have an inbuilt preference to care for your mother and your father and your siblings, and you have a kin preference, and then you probably have something like a tribal preference, and then you probably have a race preference insofar, at least insofar as other race people are somewhat novel. And so on that edifice was built up the notion of implicit bias. And of course, the DEI types grabbed the implicit bias literature and ran with it. It was a gift and a godsend to the HR types, the Karens in the HR world, who could then point to scientific validation. And now the Mazar Banerjee of Yale, of Harvard, her colleagues who helped invent the implicit association test, most of them have backed off with regards to its political implications. But Dr. Banerjee, who's really quite a leftist, right down to the core, like most social psychologists, is still beating the implicit bias drum. Okay, sorry for the lengthy explanation, but you can see that the thorniness of the problem, and that's an important thing to attend to, because the claim that we have as human beings, that we have a bias towards those who are closer to us, depending on the dimension of evaluation, appears to be true. And I'll just close with two things, and then please, push on me. That's implicit or unconscious bias. It's before you perceive. That doesn't mean that can't be overcome by learning. In fact, much of what learning does is modify your implicit biases, right? Because you have to see something a particular way when you first perceive it, but you can learn to differentiate your perception and to become more sophisticated. That's what socialization is for, and that's what education is for. But also, there's no reason to presume whatsoever on the implicit bias front that it doesn't characterize all ethnicities and racial groups equally. So I'm curious about what you think about all that. It's complicated. You know, the idea that we look at the world through a motivated framework, that's a real challenge to the Enlightenment view of rationality. And I'm afraid that the Enlightenment rationalists or the empiricists in particular, who thought that we derived all of our conceptions from sense data. That's not true. It's wrong.
Yeah, well, I don't think I would disagree with anything that you said, but with maybe perhaps the exception of, you said that we've known this for the last 100 years or so. I would argue that we've probably known most of this for as long as human beings have been self-aware, because just the basic idea that we all are biased and we're all moving through the world in a way that we aren't seeing things like exactly objectively like robots. I think that, of course, that's the case. And we all have our own priorities and preferences and motivations and goals and everything, and you carry that with you. And you bring that into every interaction and with everybody and into every situation in your life. Now, as far as that extends to even racial biases, I think history proves that that is often the case also. The problem is that on the kind of quote-unquote anti-racist DEI side of this, the issue for them is that, a couple of things. The big one is that they would probably also agree with a lot of what you just said, and even they would say that it kind of indicates their point of view. They would listen to that and say, see, this is what we're talking about. Except that for them, that applies to white people only. And if you were to say, well, no, this is just the human condition, everybody is this way, they wouldn't track you that far. They wouldn't go that far. They can't go that far. So that's really the problem. To me, that's the essential problem with the whole implicit bias conversation right now. And it might have been different 50 years ago, but right now the problem with it is that when we talk about implicit bias, we're only talking about it with one group, and we're not engaging with it as a fact of human nature, but instead as a fact of like white human nature, which these people see as something completely distinct and different from, I guess, the nature of all other people who are not white. And then the second problem with the way that they approach the issue is that they see it as something that they have to fix, which I think is an issue in and of itself, because I don't think that it's something they need to fix.
Yeah.
And then all of their prescriptions for fixing it are completely wrong. So there might be a kind of a starting point here where there's some truth in the starting point, but then it just falls apart as you continue along.
I'm taking 4 of my esteemed colleagues and you across the world.
Oh, wow, this is amazing.
To rediscover the ways our ancient ancestors developed the ideas that shaped modern society.
It was a monument to civic greatness.
To visit the places where history was made.
That is ash from the actual fires when the Babylonians burned Jerusalem from 2,500 years ago.
To walk the same roads.
We are following the path of the crucifixion.
And experience the same wonder.
We are on the site of a miracle.
What kind of resources can human beings bring to a mysterious but knowable universe?
Science, art, politics, all that makes life wonderful.
And something new about the world is revealed.
Foundations of the West. Watch now on Daily Wire Plus.
Okay, so let's delve into that a little bit more. So you said that this has been known, in some ways since the dawn of time, and the idea that people have motivations and goals and that they affect their perceptions, that's key to the whole universe of storytelling, right? Because when you tell a story, this is actually the definition of a story, a story is actually a description of the framework through which someone sees the world. So when you go to a movie, what the movie maker shows you are the goals of the protagonist. So in your movie, Am I a Racist? And you did the same thing in What is a Woman? Your goal is to conduct an investigation into something that's key to the culture war. And so we watch you as you pursue your goals, and we can see the world through your eyes, and you're enabling us to do that. And the reason that's so useful is because, well, it's useful for me to see the world through my own eyes, but if I can see the world through the eyes of another person, then I get the vantage point that they developed and that they are learning from without having to take any of the risks. Okay, so now there is a huge issue here, Matt, philosophically underneath all this, because the empiricists, and so they'd be people more on the scientific front, who claim that we derive all our knowledge of the world from facts and from objective facts, they're wrong. And the postmodernists pointed that out. Now, they weren't the only people that pointed that out. And we really don't know what to do with the fact that we see the world through a story, because that's not what the scientists claimed. It's not what the Enlightenment types claimed. And they were definitely wrong. And this is a big problem. Now, my solution to that, for what it's worth, is to observe that we've had evolved ways of looking at the world. They biologically evolved and culturally evolved, and they express themselves in the form of traditional religious views. But we can get into that a little bit later. And if those decline or dissolve, then you have the emergence of these terrible ideologies. So the implicit bias types and the postmodernists have a point. We do see the world through a story. Okay, now here's an explanation of why it's only white people that are racist from the radical leftist perspective. That's where I see the Marxism creeping in. So what happened when in the 1970s, the postmodernist types, Derrida and Foucault and so forth. Foucault is the world's most cited scholar, by the way, the world's most cited scholar, more than Darwin. So the postmodernists climbed in bed with the Marxists. Almost all the postmodernists were Marxists to begin with, like radically leftist. There's no doubt about this on the historical side. And then Marxism took a vicious hit on the moral side in the 1970s, not least because of Solzhenitsyn, who exposed all the catastrophes of the Stalinist system. And then the postmodernists, the French in particular, they played a sleight of hand game and they transformed Marxism into a multi-dimensional power game. So for Marx, the axis of oppression was economic.
Hey there, truth seekers and freethinkers. Are you tired of the same old merch that doesn't quite capture your intellectual spirit? Well, buckle up, because we've got some exciting news that'll make your synapses fire. Introducing the official Daily Wire merch store on Sticker Mule. Sticker Mule isn't just any old merch company. They are the internet's favorite place for custom stickers, magnets, and more. In response to the Trump assassination attempt, Sticker Mule's co-founder and CEO vocalized his support for the former president and called for an end to political hate. Now they're bringing you exclusive Daily Wire gear that'll make your liberal arts professor do a double take. By shopping at stickermule.com/dailywire, you're not just getting awesome merch, you're supporting free speech and standing up against leftist groupthink. Plus, a portion of every sale goes directly to support the Daily Wire. So what are you waiting for? Head over to stickermule.com/dailywire today. That's stickermule.com/dailywire.
And I think if you had to make a case for an axis of oppression, the strongest case you can make is economic. But the new Marxist types, the type that we see now as the leftist radical, they multiplied that so virtually every dimension of comparison that you could use to categorize human beings became an axis of oppression, right? So race, ethnicity, sex, height, looks, ability, you name it. If it distinguished people, it was an axis of oppression. It was like a metastasized Marxism. And because in principle, white people are at the top of the oppression hierarchy, they're the only ones that can be the oppressor. And then, so this is the real toxic element of the narrative as far as I'm concerned, that victimizer narrative. It's also empirically preposterous because it's actually the case that, first of all, white people, depending on how you define white, aren't at the top of the economic hierarchy in the United States. The wealthiest people are Indian Americans from the continent of India, for example, and Asians of all sorts do spectacularly well in the American economy, as do Nigerians. Black women do pretty well, as it turns out, and Asian women do quite spectacularly well. And of course, there's the ever-present fact that Jews do disproportionately well too. And so it isn't even obvious that white people are at the top of the economic hierarchy, but the reason that the radicals insist that racism is only a white problem is because of this Marxism that's crept into the stew. And so, well, I'm curious about what you think about that.
Yeah, well, I think the victim hierarchy on the left is what this comes down to, and I think what you just pointed out, and this is a big problem for the leftists, that they've never come up with anything approaching a satisfactory answer for it. But the fact that white people are supposedly at the top of the pile, the top of the heap, as it was put to me by someone in the film, but Asians are actually above white people. The fact that what you alluded to, that African immigrants do, by almost every measure, significantly better in this country than Black Americans who have lived here for multiple generations. That fact alone is that completely destroys their entire narrative, because you would think that if the hierarchy and the victim axis worked the way they said, then you would think that, you know, Black immigrants would be the worst off, because they not only are they Black, but also they're immigrants, which are supposedly oppressed as well. That's not the case. And that's an easy thing to explain, by the way, because when you look at all of the groups that do pretty well in this country, and then you compare that with their marriage rates and their divorce rates, you like, the math is pretty simple here. Asians do well. They also get married and stay married. African immigrants get married and stay married. White people do, our divorce rates are not great. Out of wedlock birth rates for whites are going up. And whites also are going down, are traveling down the other way and becoming less successful in comparison to these other groups. So to me, it's there are probably many factors that explain why these various groups perform well, but that's the number one. And if there's an exception to this, I'm not sure. I mean, is there an example of a demographic group that has sky-high divorce rates, sky-high out-of-wedlock birth rates, but also performs pretty well economically? I can't think of an exception.
Well, there's an interesting example on the Asian side. So if you bring, say, first-generation Asians do comparatively well in the United States, and their children do better than Americans do. But if Asians are in the country for 3 generations, then their performance declines to the point of the average American. So there's obviously something cultural going on, and it's hard to specify exactly what's going on in the cultures of the immigrant people who do well, but you can speculate, at least, and probably with particular accuracy on the Asian side, that there's a tremendous emphasis on getting the hell out there and working yourself half to death because your parents took the risk of their life by immigrating, and you better get your act together and succeed. And so there's a kind of desperation, I think, that drives the success of the immigrant groups that you're describing. And why that isn't present in our culture, well, that's a hard question too. We don't exactly know what drives people to be conscientious. And conscientiousness is the big personality predictor of long-term success. And conscientious people are diligent and orderly and industrious. More importantly, I would say they probably are good at foregoing immediate gratification and planning for not only for the long term, but also sacrificing themselves for the good of other people. If you're married, for example, you want to make your marriage work, it can't be all about you. And the same applies to your wife. Both of you have to prioritize the marriage over either of your immediate short-term needs. And you really have to do that with kids even more, which is why I don't think people ever grow up till they have kids, because I don't think you can grow up till someone is more important than you are. And that doesn't happen to most people until they have children. And then it's kind of self-evident at that point. And so we don't exactly know what's necessary in a culture to instantiate that ethos of self-sacrifice and conscientiousness, but it does seem to be the case that it's more prevalent among the immigrant communities that do particularly well.
Would you say this, the issue I just raised with the marriage rates, intact families, how much do you think that plays into it? Even like that's a big part of raising kids to be conscientious, is they have to, I would think, have a mother and father in the home who are focused on, instilling that in them. And in the Black community, the rates of fatherless out-of-wedlock births are like 70, 80%, especially in the inner city. It's just this catastrophic, like apocalyptic type numbers. You can't have a functioning community or a functioning society when the numbers are that high.
Yeah, well, we don't know the relationship between fatherlessness, let's say, and conscientiousness. And that's a study that should clearly be done. But we do know probably more accurately than we know anything else in the developmental psychological literature that fatherlessness is a catastrophe. Fatherless kids do abysmally. Well, here's an example, Matt. This is so striking. Everyone listening should take this with a tremendous amount of seriousness. Fatherless girls undergo puberty on average more than 1 year earlier. Now, that's a walloping biological effect, and an early one. And the life expectancy of fatherless children is lower as well, and that's because they undergo chromosomal damage because of stress. So right at the biological level, there are massive consequences of fatherlessness. And probably, having a father is an example of your father, if he sticks around, provides an example of long-term, other-focused commitment across all the ups and downs of life, right? If you have a father who hangs in there, if your parents are honest, you see them contending with each other, wrestling with each other, fighting with each other as they try to sort out the complex problems of life. There's lots of tragedies that a married couple goes through, lots of difficulties, and the example of committed monogamy shows people that it's possible to make a voluntary bond, a contract or a covenant that extends across decades, regardless of the difficulties that goes your way. And you commented on the accelerating rates of fatherlessness in the Black community. That is a complete bloody catastrophe. And here's, I think, the explanation for it. Tell me what you think about this. So imagine a pyramidal structure that represents economic position in the patriarchy. Let's put it that way. Okay, now imagine that you stress the system, and one of the ways you could stress it is by defining the family unit as the fundamental basis of oppression, and that all other family arrangements are fine, and that it's okay to love whoever you want for as long as you want, or for as short as you want, like let's say the next hour, and that's perfectly acceptable. And then you throw that into the culture, which is what we did in the early 1960s. And then you might ask, well, who is that going to destabilize first? And the answer to that's crystal clear. The lower you are on the socioeconomic ladder, the more catastrophic the results of a sociological intervention like that are likely to be. And so the Black community tended to be at the lower end of the pyramidal distribution. And so that radical sociological change that emerged in the 1960s affected them first. And Black families started to fall apart in the 60s, and that's been accelerating ever since, until we get the numbers that you are pointing to. But one of the things we should absolutely 100% be clear about is that Hispanics and Caucasians are not far behind. So there has been a decline in marital stability in the white and the Hispanic community since the 60s. And if you match the curves, the Hispanics and the whites are about 10 to 15 years behind the Black community. So that cataclysmic collapse is starting to spread through our entire culture. It's just that the Black population happens to be at the forefront of it. And we know perfectly well that fatherlessness, apart from the biological effects, early puberty for girls, why do girls hit puberty early if they don't have a father around? Well, how about so they become sexually attractive earlier so that a man shows up? How about that for a theory, which seems to be precisely the explanation? And so that's not exactly so good, because probably it's not that good to throw yourself into a sexual relationship when you're still psychologically a child, despite the fact that you might be physically mature. So that's quite the catastrophe. And fatherless boys are much more likely to be in prison. They're much more likely to drop out of school. They're much less likely to attain gainful employment. They're much less likely to be reliable marital partners. And so it's a cascading effect. It's a complete bloody catastrophe. And even the conservatives have been stupid about this. You know, I talked to a conservative leader the other day, and I asked him about families, and he said, well, you know, as long as two people love each other. And I think, no, I don't think so. Not just as long as two people love each other. Love each other, what does that mean, love? Without commitment. Does it mean love for tonight? Does it mean sexual desire? Or does it mean that you're going to commit to someone for decades, for better or for worse? Like, what does love exactly mean here? And then, you know, is there a model for love other than monogamous, child-centered, long-term committed family? It's like, well, can 3 people be a family? How about 5? How about 7? Swapping sexual partners. How about a man and a man? That's not a model that's going to duplicate well across society, because 2 men have a very difficult time reproducing, in case anyone hasn't noticed. And so the fatherless catastrophe is definitely, it's germane, Matt, and it's not an issue that people are prone to highlight because they don't want to be tarred with the brush of, you know, prejudice. And prejudice and judgment, they're hard to dissociate from one another. And But I can't see any other model for long-term viability of children than stable, committed, long-term, child-centered, heterosexual, monogamous couples. And people can go to hell in a handbasket, as far as I'm concerned, whatever way they want. But we're bloody fools if we think there's any ideal at the center of a culture that can replace that. And I think the evidence for that is everywhere, as you already pointed out.
Yeah, I think people, well, the fact that we're not talking about it just means that no real improvements can be made culturally, because this is to my mind, the first issue that has to be addressed. And if we're not going to address it, then you can't solve anything else farther downstream. And I think that people don't want to talk about it because, yeah, it's not politically correct. It's not sensitive. Also because I think we just talked about how everyone has their own personal bias. I think because fatherless rates and out-of-wedlock birth rates are so prevalent now, that a lot of the people who should be having this conversation don't want to talk about it because they're a part of that very problem. You know, they've abandoned their kids, they've abandoned their marriages, and so they don't want to indict themselves. I do think, just to back up, you said, you know, is it enough for two people to love each other? And of course, this is the common thing we hear on the left. I think the answer to that is that it is enough for two people to love each other, as long as we define love the right way. You know, if we all had the right conception of love, then it could just be as simple as that. And to define love, I think Thomas Aquinas said love is to will the good of the other. And, you know, in a religious context, what I would say is that to love is another way of putting that is to love someone is to try to help them get to heaven. And that's my job as a child, as a parent. I help my children get to heaven. So if we define love that way, then yes, in fact, that could be the guiding principle of your life. And if you are trying to will the good of the other at all times, then it can rarely steer you wrong. But people don't see it that way. They see it as an emotional thing.
A short-term emotional thing too, which is even worse, because short-term matters. Hey, I'll tell you something cool and interesting that's very relevant to this, and it's terrifying. So in the biological world, there are two reproductive strategies. You can conceptualize it as a continuum. And there are low investment strategies and high investment strategies. So the low investment strategies characterize animals, many animals, mosquitoes, fish, mosquitoes, let's talk about, or fish. It's sex without commitment and many, many offspring, right? So a mosquito doesn't invest in any of its children. There's the sexual element, fertilization of many eggs, like with fish, up to millions of offspring. Let's say in the case of plants, for example, puffballs, I think, produce billions of spores. Almost all of them die, and just enough survive to propagate the species, right? So it's a low investment, high production strategy. On the other end, you have animals that reproduce slowly and invest a lot in their offspring. And human beings are the most extreme example of that strategy. So we have very few offspring, and we actually make a multi-generational investment in them, because it's not only that you're a parent, you're also a grandparent. And one of the explanations for the human lifespan from the evolutionary side is that we get as old as we get because there's utility to having grandparents around. So anyways, to have a child, a human child that flourishes, requires an investment that spans decades. Okay, so we're a high investment species. Now, imagine you took the same logic and you looked within human beings and you said, well, there's going to be human beings that tilt more towards a short-term investment strategy, and there's going to be human beings that tilt more towards a long-term investment strategy. So the short-term investors they'd be the hedonists, Matt. They'd be the ones who are pursuing the one-night stands and that believe that love is free and that every form of sexual expression is acceptable and that you should just do your own thing and let it all hang out. And they started to, what would you say, march forward en masse in the 1960s, probably partly because birth control made that a more viable philosophy, practically speaking. Okay, so let's say you can identify Well, let's start with men. You can identify men who have a short-term mating strategy versus men who are high investment. Now, you might ask, well, what are the characterological differences between those men? And this is where it gets fun. The short-term oriented maters, men, are psychopathic, Machiavellian, narcissistic, and sadistic. So isn't that fun? So what that means for women is that if women pursue men who are oriented towards one-night stands, let's say, and casual sex, they end up delivering themselves to the dark tetrad types, the psychopathic, narcissistic, Machiavellian sadists. Now, you can say the same thing about women, is that women, it's rarer for women to adopt a short-term mating strategy because sex is more costly for women, obviously. They pay a higher emotional price for short-term pairings. They're more likely to mistake short-term pairings for genuine emotional commitment, and they're much more likely to be psychopathological if they adopt a short-term strategy to mating, independent of that. And so what we also see with the breakdown of the family, because that breakdown facilitates short-term mating strategies, is that we see the untrammeled rise of the psychopathic narcissist. Like, I see that making, as a clinician, making itself manifest in the hedonistic pride movement continue. It's like, we can have sex with whoever we want, whenever we want, under any conditions whatsoever. It's like, okay, who are you? Oh, well, we're the psychopathic narcissists who never grew up. It's like, oh, those are you. Those are the people marching in the streets for their hedonistic sexual freedom. And we're going to turn the culture over to them with their short-term, self-oriented, pure emotional gratification view of the world, where everything's about them now. It's no different than turning the world over to the worst behaved 2-year-olds you could possibly imagine. And I mean that technically too, because all of that is a sign of radical failure to mature. So isn't that fun? All that literature is basically out the last 4 or 5 years, identifying the relationship between the psychopathic narcissists and the short-term mating strategies.
Going online without ExpressVPN is like not paying attention to the safety demonstration on a flight. Most of the time, you'll probably be fine, but what if one day that weird yellow mask drops down from overhead and you have no idea what to do? In our hyper-connected world, your digital privacy isn't just a luxury, it's a fundamental right. Every time you connect to an unsecured network in a cafe, hotel, or airport, you're essentially broadcasting your personal information to anyone with the technical know-how to intercept it. And let's be clear, it doesn't take a genius hacker to do this. With some off-the-shelf hardware, even a tech-savvy teenager could potentially access your passwords, bank logins, and credit card details. Now, you might think, what's the big deal? Who want my data anyway? Well, on the dark web, your personal information could fetch up to $1,000. That's right, there's a whole underground economy built on stolen identities. Enter ExpressVPN. It's like a digital fortress, creating an encrypted tunnel between your device and the internet. Their encryption is so robust that it would take a hacker with a supercomputer over 1 billion years to crack it. But don't let its power fool you. ExpressVPN is incredibly user-friendly. With just one click, you're protected across all your devices. Phones, laptops, tablets, you name it. That's why I use ExpressVPN whenever I'm traveling or working from a coffee shop. It gives me peace of mind knowing that my research, communications, and personal data are shielded from prying eyes. Secure your online data today by visiting expressvpn.com/Jordan. That's expressvpn.com/Jordan, and you can get an extra 3 months free. expressvpn.com/Jordan.
Brutal.
Yeah, I was just, there was a clip that went viral on Twitter I saw a day or two ago of someone on some podcast, that's a self-professed queer person, saying that, talking about, and he's HIV positive, and he was explaining why he doesn't think he should have to divulge the fact that he's HIV positive to any sexual partners of his. And basically the answer is that, like, doesn't make, it's uncomfortable for him to talk about it, and he shouldn't have to do it. And it kind of goes to show, it's right, and it's no surprise that this is a self-professed queer person, because on the LGBT activist side, it is entirely a celebration of the self and pursuing your own desires at any cost whatsoever, to the point where now you have LGBT activists, some of them anyway, coming out and saying that, you should be able to pass along HIV if you want to, because it doesn't matter what anyone else says. We talk about this and how it leads to fatherless homes and everything else. I think the other, even more catastrophic consequence is that it also leads to eventually the decline in population, because what ends up happening, I think, is that people give up on having kids. And I think there's a lot of people in my generation that were raised by parents like this, either broken homes or maybe both parents were there physically, but they were very self-centered and just kind of miserable parents. And so then those children grow up, and that's the only example of parenthood that they have. And so they associate being a parent with just abject misery, and so then swear it off entirely. And I think that we see that now. I was just talking on my YouTube channel. I put up a video a couple days ago. Went to the Reddit. It's called Regretful Parents. There's a Reddit forum. It's a very dark and disturbing place, as you can imagine. And it's just nothing but parents, as the name implies, parents who had kids and regret it. Now quite openly hate their own children. I mean, some of these, I read a few of them, and it's mothers with 5-year-old daughters expressing that they hate their daughters just for existing, because their kids are infringing on their lifestyle and making them do things they don't want to do. And then you just think, well, when those kids grow up, because of course those kids know that they're hated, even if they can't put it into words. And those kids grow up, and many of them are probably going to say, well, this is what having kids is all about, then I don't want to do it. They don't know any other way. And then you end up with people that just swear off family life entirely, I think, because of it.
Well, I think, too, Matt, it's possible that that's also what's manifesting itself in the proclivity of young people not to date and have relationships. There's lots of young women out there who've never seen anything remotely resembling a positive male role model. And it's no bloody wonder that those girls are attracted by the radical leftist insistence that the patriarchy is an oppressive monster. It's interesting, I read Rob Henderson's book. Unfortunately, at the moment, I can't remember his name. Rob ended up with a PhD in psychology, but he came from the foster care system, and his foster parents were broken family types, and so were the families of all the working class kids that he associated with. And it's perfectly possible now to grow up as a girl and never encounter a man who can commit to anything. Not to a job, not to a person, not to his own future, right? The funny thing about the hedonists is that they take advantage of their future selves just as badly as they take advantage of everyone else. And this is the problem with being guided by short-term emotional gratification. It's like a 2-year-old is motivated by short-term gratification, emotional gratification, but you don't see them organizing themselves into effective 2-year-old societies and planning for the future. Like, to plan for the future and to take everyone else into account requires a lot of socialization and maturation, and it requires a model. And these girls that don't have the model of positive masculinity, they assume that men are there to do nothing but take short-term sexual gratification and carry none of the load. It's no bloody wonder they're skeptical of the patriarchy and then avoidant of men. And it's no wonder that they also see any claim of a man to being competent and productive as just a lie to mask his essential proclivity to take advantage and depart. And so it is a cascading spiral of failure, and there's many communities that are caught in that. Now, I'll give you an example of this. It's weird, Matt. So when I go do my lectures, my wife does the introduction, and then she does the Q&A. And we didn't exactly plan that. As we've been touring around, I've had different people open for me. Dave Rubin did for a while. My daughter Michaela did for a while. I've had various special guests, Douglas Murray, for example, who've done that. At one point, for the opening, we were just doing some advertising for this essay product that my son is working on, and for this Peterson Academy that we've launched, this online university. And Michaela when she was introducing me, was talking about those ventures. And then she decided to go pursue her own things. And I asked my wife if she would do the intros. And she said yes. And so that's how that came about. And then she did the Q&As, and that sort of branched into her pursuing her own description of my rules and so forth at the beginning of the show. Okay, so sorry for all the detailed background, but one of the things that we found was that people were very pleased to have her on stage with me. And so we were watching YouTube comments, for example, when people were viewing this, and what we came to understand was that a very large proportion of the audience had never seen a man and a woman sit down together, like a married couple, sit down together and actually do something productive and useful and peaceful voluntarily together. So just this example, Matt, so when the audience asks questions for the Q&A, those are submitted electronically, and then Tammy goes through them to see which ones are upvoted, but also to sort of string together a coherent set of questions in a conversation. And so then she asks me the questions, and then she actually listens to the answers actively, and sometimes probes further. And we were stunned to find how much of a relief that was for people just to see that it was possible. And that's so catastrophic because it shows you the depth of misery, I suppose is a good way of thinking about it, that characterize so many people's lives, is that they're relieved to see a display of genuine cooperation between a committed man and woman. That's really sad. It's really sad. So a lot of these girls who are susceptible to the blandishments of the left, it's not surprising in a sense when you look at their autobiographical background.
Yeah, I think for the boys too, you have girls that, as you say, grow up and never have an example of a male role model. I think it's probably even more disastrous for the boys who grow up having never had that example, because for a girl that means that they're not going to know what to expect from men, how to interact with men, they're not going to trust men and so on. But for boys, it means like they don't know how to be what they are. And that's one thing. Myself, as the father of 4 boys, 2 of them are still babies, but 2 are a bit older now. And you really notice that as a father when you have sons, that they, and that's why I think it's people ask me sometimes, like, is it harder to have boys or girls? Because I have two girls as well. I think, there are different challenges with both sexes, but I think probably for a father, it's in a way harder to have boys if you take it seriously, because there's more pressure. I think as a father of girls, I think there's a little bit less pressure on you, but as boys, you could just feel them watching you all the time, because they're looking to you to figure out how they are supposed to be in the world, how they're supposed to act. The boys have all this kind of energy, all of this they're just bursting at the seams with energy and all this desire to, like, I know with my boys, they want to run out into the woods every single moment of the day. They don't even want to be inside the house. They don't want to be contained at all. And so they have all of this, and they're looking at me as an example of how do you harness that? What do you do with that? And so it's cool. I know that if I give them the bad example, then I've set them up for failure. A big part of it is, this isn't all of it, but when you see these boys in the inner city that join gangs and they go out and they do, not just in the inner city, but teenage boys can be known to do things that are just absurdly dangerous, almost suicidal, even if they are not actually suicidal. And I think it's because there's this masculine urge for risk-taking. And one of the most important roles of a father, I think, is to show a boy, like, how do you take risks in a healthy way? What are healthy risks to take? And if you don't have a father there to show you how to do that, to show you what that means, then you end up, then you have a teenage boy who's drunk and driving 105 miles an hour on a back road somewhere, because that's his way of taking a risk. He didn't have a father to show him, more constructive ways of taking risks.
Yeah, well, okay, a couple of things on that. It's like, boys are definitely more difficult to socialize than girls. There's no doubt about that. I'll say the tables will turn when your daughters become teenagers, so be prepared for that, because they experience a whole new form of exposure to risk then. And well, but boys are less agreeable than girls, and so they are more risk-taking and exploratory. So, for example, men and women differ within the dimension of extroversion. Men are more assertive and women are more enthusiastic. There are pretty reliable sex differences in temperament. Most of them seem biologically grounded. You can distinguish between men and women with 75% accuracy on the basis of personality scales alone. And if you include interest, because women are more interested in people and men are more interested in things on average, you can increase that diagnostic ability. So that's independent of any physiological science, right? Just if you just knew someone's personality and their interests, you can very reliably categorize them as men or women. There's no evidence whatsoever that that's cultural, by the way, because those differences get bigger in more egalitarian societies. This is very well known by psychologists, even if they're afraid to talk about it, which they are. So it is harder to socialize boys. And the way we socialize them to take risks, fundamentally, as far as I'm concerned, is by encouraging them to take responsibility, right? And it's a time frame issue, again, is you want your boys to be able to carry a maximal load. And there's adventure in that, but that has to be a socialized adventure. So let's delve into that a little bit. How long have you been married?
Almost 13 years.
Okay, why do you like being married?
Oh, wow.
Well, why not just look, you're a famous guy and you have a lot of money. And so, in principle, you could have women at your disposal if you wanted to go that route. That's very, very common for celebrities. And so I could say to you, look, well, why not have your cake and eat it too? You could keep up the appearance of your marriage, but you could be having plenty of action on the side. And I'm presuming you're not doing that. And if the opportunity is there, which it is now, because many men are going to be monogamous or involuntarily celibate because they don't have the bloody opportunity. So there's no morality in that. But you're now in a position where you could pretty much do whatever the hell you wanted on the sexual front. And so why are you committed to your marriage? What's in it for you?
Well, I would say, yeah, it's interesting because there's, and you could say I have to say this if I'm speaking publicly, but it also, and maybe I do, but it also happens to be true that there is nothing about the scenario that you just described that I find even remotely appealing. The idea of being unfaithful to my wife, I find it's a horror show when I think about it. Like every aspect of that is a horror show. Okay. Nothing about it I find even remotely tempting.
Okay, why? Why is it a horror show? Why is it a horror show when you think about it?
Well, because everything you're bringing into your life is terrible. You're bringing lies and deception and betrayal into your life. I also happen to love my wife very much, and as we just talked about, loving, I believe, is willing the good of the other. That is very much not willing what is good for her or my family. Every part of it, I don't see any advantage. I don't see anything about it that's appealing at all. And it's the same if I were to imagine having never been married at all, and being single right now, and then at least you don't have the betrayal and all of that. But that also I find incredibly unappealing. I quite literally thank God every day that I'm married. I look at people who aren't, and I feel sorry for them, especially men. And as you point out, there are men who want to be, they just don't have the opportunity. And I feel an immense amount of sympathy for them. I would hate to be in their position. I don't want to lay it on them even thicker if they're watching right now, but I feel for them. I'm incredibly happy to be married all the time. And I guess the reason is, it's only difficult to answer the question because the reasons are really infinite in a lot of ways, but it brings meaning into my life every day that wouldn't be there without it. It brings purpose. There are people in my life who I can love in a way that if they weren't there, I just wouldn't. Yeah, I could. You could have friends that you love your siblings and your parents, but especially having experienced it now, I know that it's just a different kind of love that I have for my own kids and my own wife, that if I didn't have them, I wouldn't have any opportunity for that kind of love, either to give it or to receive it. And as I said, to me, not having that is nothing but pure horror. I see no advantage of it.
Right, so you outlined two dimensions there. You said that, if you took the short-term mating strategy route, let's say, that would introduce all sorts of deception and lies and betrayal and brokenness into your family. So that's sort of on the hell side. And, when I used to counsel people who were thinking about having an affair, one of the things I would do with them was think it through. It's like, so what's your fantasy here? I see. So you found someone new and you're having fun with them and you find them very attractive, but they don't have to bear any of the responsibility for your continued life together. They get all the fun. And your wife, who you're thinking about cheating on, she gets all the responsibility and the burden. And so now you have this imaginary person that you do nothing with but play with. And that's a person who's also willing to break up a marriage. So that's the sort of person that you've tangled yourself up in. And what, you're just going to keep this secret? So you're going to lie constantly now about everything for the rest of your life while you betray your wife. And you're going to pretend that there's something positive in that for you and your wife and your children. That's the game that you're going to play. And often, not always, but often when people started to think it through, they changed their mind. Now, and you also talked about the positive side. When I worked, my first job as a professor was at Harvard, and my wife and I moved down to Boston, and we had our second child there. And Tammy stayed home with the kids for a variety of reasons, one of which was that she didn't have a green card. There were other reasons too, because she wanted to be with the kids. And all I did was work and spend time with my family. That was it, because at that point in my life, it was necessary to cut out everything that was extraneous if I was going to be successful at those two things. But there wasn't anything I ever found more enjoyable than spending time with my kids and my wife. It was great. And you have a quality of love from your children that you will not get anywhere else in your life, period. And that's the same is true if you are actually in a committed relationship with someone. And the depth of that, what I've been trying to lecture to people, young people around the world, is that you find the meaning in your life through adopting long-term responsibility. And your kids are the only people you'll ever meet in your life who want more than anything else to have a good relationship with you. That's what they offer you. And that's such a gift. I mean, you alluded to that. It's such a gift. And the thing is, too, it's also something, we have a society that's searching for meaning. It's like having a committed relationship with someone for 60 years, which is what you'll have with your kids if you're fortunate. That's actually quite meaningful. And then you have grandkids too, and that's another source of bountiful provision of stability and responsibility and love. And, conservatives have done a very bad job of selling this to young people, because they always take the dutiful side and portray it as an obligation and not an opportunity. And that's just ridiculous. And even on the sexual side, so the purely sexual side, the people who have the most sex are religious people in long-term committed monogamous relationships. At least the heterosexual people who have the most sex. So that's pretty interesting. Who the hell would have guessed that? And then you might also contemplate for a moment the difference between sex with love and sex without love. And sex without love produces a fair bit of post-coital regret, both on the side of the man and the woman. And that's a real symptom of just exactly what the hell's going on, which is something like mutual short-term exploitation. And then the realization of that. And sex with love, that's a whole different enterprise.